Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will be splitting my time with the member for Mississauga Lakeshore. It is my pleasure to rise today to speak in support of the government's proposed response to amendments to Bill C-7 made in the Senate. I applaud this bill and the process that has led up to where we are today. Mr. Speaker, it is clear that the government and members of the Senate both agree that we need to support regular RCMP members and reservists by creating a labor relations regime that promotes their rights to collective bargaining. Who could be more deserving of such support than the dedicated and proud members of Canada's National Police Service? These heroic men and women combat organized crime and defend our country against terrorists. They guard us from those who deal in illicit drugs and those who commit economic crimes. And they provide contract policing services in 8 provinces and 3 territories. This is by no means an exhaustive list of what these brave individuals do to protect Canadians. These men and women, recognized as a symbol of Canada around the world, deserve our respect. The motion before us today gives members the respect they are due while addressing the key concerns of the Senate. Tout d'abord, la motion l'a faite.
First of all, the motion removes the proposed restrictions on the RCMP, which can be because these other issues can be included in a collective agreement or an arbitral award.
And second, by implementing a more targeted management rights clause, which focuses on the authorities that the RCMP Commissioner needs to ensure effective policing operations. Ensemble, ces deux modifications.
Together, these 2 amendments would broaden the scope of what could be debated and possibly included in a collective agreement, and would meet or respond to the main criticism of Bill C-7.
These amendments would ensure the employer and any future RCMP member, bargaining agent, could engage meaningfully in discussions in good faith on subjects of importance to RCMP members and reservists. Mr. Speaker, allow me to provide a few examples of subject matters that could be included in a collective agreement or an arbitral award. First, matters commonly associated with harassment and workplace wellness, including, for example, the promotion of a respectful workplace, early conflict resolution, and workplace remediation. Second, general aspects associated with the appointment and appraisals of RCMP members. Third, criteria and timing for conducting the appraisals of RCMP members. And fourth, members to mitigate the impact of discharges and demotions of RCMP members, including workforce adjustment provisions. Clearly, Mr. Speaker, the government has listened to the concerns raised and expanded on what may be included in a collective agreement or an arbitral award. As is the practice for other negotiations in the public service, a wide range of other matters can be bargained and included in a collective agreement or an arbitral award. These include rates of pay, hours of work, and leave provisions as such, designated paid holidays, vacation leave, sick leave, and parental leave. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to take this opportunity to comment on the management rights clause related to the RCMP Commissioner's human resources management responsibilities. This clause was first suggested and adopted in the Senate, and we believe there is much merit to such a clause. In fact, it is proposed that the government adopt a more targeted management rights clause to focus on the authorities that the Commissioner needs to ensure effective police operations. The amended and more targeted management rights clause would allow all proposals related to matters that were covered by RCMP specific restrictions in Bill C-7, as originally proposed, to be discussed at the negotiating table. It would also allow the parties to potentially incorporate these matters in a collective agreement, except where the employer considers that they infringe on the authority of the RCMP Commissioner to ensure effective police operations. Should the bargaining agent seek to go to arbitration, the chairperson of the Public Service Labour Relations and Employment Board would decide whether the proposal infringes on management rights before the matter could be referred to arbitration. The adoption of a management rights clause for the RCMP is consistent with the labor relations regime that applies to the rest of the federal public service. Mr. Speaker, let me now turn to why it is important to preserve the restrictions that replicate those applying to other areas of the federal public service. Since 1967, matters that are of broad cross-sectional interest, such as pensions, are included from bargaining and dealt with under the legislation to ensure that the public interest is taken into account. Pensions for the rest of the public service are dealt with under the Public Service Superannuation Act. Pensions require a high degree of stability to assure pension plan members that their benefits are secure and will be delivered as expected. However, the federal government has traditionally consulted with employee representatives on pension issues and is committed to continue this practice. In the case of the RCMP Superannuation Act requires that an RCMP Pension Advisory Committee be established. Mr. Speaker, the RCMP is a national police service operating within the federal public administration. This is why the proposed labor relations regime for the RCMP was designed to align with the federal existing framework for labor relations and collective bargaining. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, I will not have time to speak to the government's proposed response to the other two amendments that concerns of secret ballot vote and the other one that addresses the mandate of the Public Service Relations and Employment Board, but I would like to close with a clear and an unequivocal statement. The government is committed to supporting RCMP members and reservists by providing them with a meaningful process for collective bargaining. Our proposed response addresses the key concerns of the Senate. It also takes into account the RCMP's role as a police organization. And finally, it ensures that its labor relations regime is aligned with the regime that applies to other federal public servants. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for her remarks, and I'll give her a chance to address the matter of the secret ballot with my question. There seems to be a fairly significant contradiction between this Liberal government's defence of the secret ballot in corrupt United Nations commissions and agencies, for example, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, or the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, which sees secret ballots covering the way Canada voted for the election of non-democratic countries to significant positions on these bodies. Saudi Arabia certainly notable in both of those cases. So I'd like to ask my colleague, how she rationalizes the objection to the secret ballot amendment before us today, at the same time that she talks about respect for members of the RCMP.
Honourable Member for Markham Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member opposite for that question. Our government believes that we will bring in some fairness back to the collective bargaining regime for members of the RCMP. We are rejecting the amendment for secret ballots because it is at odds with Bill C-4, which will restore a fair and level playing field to labor relations. We believe that the Labor Relations Board should have the ability to decide whether a vote or a card check is the most appropriate and fair method for certification on a case-by-case basis. There is no reason to treat the RCMP differently in this regard. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Victoria.
Speaker, there have been discussions among the parties, and if you were to seek it, I think you would find that there's consent to adopt the following motion: that notwithstanding any standing order or usual practice of the House, the recorded division on the amendment to the opposition motion in the name of the member for Beloit-Chambly, deferred until the expiry of the time provided for oral questions this day, be further deferred until the expiry of the time provided for government orders later today, and that notwithstanding the order adopted December 1st, 2016, the provisions under Standing Order 45 respecting the length of bells shall apply today, and finally, that notwithstanding any standing order or usual practice of the House, following oral questions on Tuesday, May 16, 2017, a member from each recognized party, as well as the member for Pierre Boucher, Les Patriotes Verchères, and the member for Saanich Gulf Islands may make a brief statement. Thank you.
Does the honourable member have the unanimous consent of the House to move the motion? Yes. Agreed. The House has heard the terms of the motion. Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion? Yes. Carried. Okay, questions and comments? The honourable member for Vancouver Quadra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for her speech on the Bill C-7 that we're discussing today. And she mentioned that in the Management Rights Clause amendment that the Management Rights Clause will be consistent with the labour relations approach in the rest of the public service. And she specified that that means that if there were something that the management believed would be contrary to the effectiveness of police operations, if it were to be bargained, that it would then go to the Public Service Labour and Relations and Employment Board to determine whether it would be in or out of scope of the bargaining. Now, Mr. Speaker, the previous speaker in the House from the NDP was implying that these management rights could be akin to reinstating the original exclusions, which would give a lot more of the power as to what to negotiate or not into the hands of the RCMP commissioner. However, what we heard in her speech is that it's actually the PSLREB that would determine whether something was in or out of scope of bargaining. So I would love to have her comment on whether or not this new management rights clause in this final, hopefully final version of Bill C-7 actually provides that neutral party determining what's in or out of scope of the bargaining.
Honourable member for Markham Thornhill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my honourable colleague for that question. We do agree that a management rights clause should be in this bill, and what the government is proposing is to adopt a more targeted management rights clause than that adopted by the Senate to focus on the authorities that the Commissioner needs to ensure effective police operations. The adoption of a management rights clause for the RCMP is consistent with the labour relations regime that applies to the rest of the federal public service and with that of other police forces across the country. If there is a dispute between RCMP management and the eventual bargaining agent about what exactly falls within the management rights clause, the dispute will be resolved by the Public Service Labour Relations Board. It is important to emphasize that the management rights clause does not give RCMP management carte blanche to exclude things from collective bargaining.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for